Well, good morning. It feels really scandalous to have so many chairs in here. It's like, oh man, and not to have assigned seat, and it's kind of crazy. But here we are now. It's quite exciting, though. So we just finished a series on the book of Psalms. We covered about 6 Psalms out of 150. So I guess we've covered the whole book now, and there's no need to go back, right? Judging by our other series, though, it seems to be kind of what we're doing, you know? I mean, if you consider the book of Exodus, the series we did back in the fall, we could have spent more time on the sections we were at, and, we could have hit other ones that we kind of missed. And the case was even more so for the Gospel of John, where we were kind of skipping more material than we covered, unfortunately. I guess it was just the way it had to be. But today, then, just kind of doing a little bit of cleanup a little bit, we're going to go back to the Gospel of John one more time and look at a passage that we probably should have considered when we were doing the series. If you have a Bible, please turn to John chapter 8. The Gospel of John chapter 8. I guess more specifically, we're going to be looking at John chapter 7, 53 to 8, 11. This passage is the story about the woman caught in adultery. And for many reasons, it's a very interesting story, not least of which the fact that in most modern versions of the Bible, there's this note that tells us that it's not included in the earliest and best manuscripts. We're going to ignore that for right now. Hopefully next week we're going to talk about that, but we're just going to ignore it for right now. And even if we do ignore it, this story has got some kinds of peculiarities to it that really make us kind of not totally sure what to do. I mean, at one level, this story is perfectly Jesus, right? I mean, it seems to exhibit his character perfectly, his grace and his mercy and his love. And yet, there's something about this story that just doesn't seem to jive with what Jesus says in other places in the Bible. So like, for example, in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, we read this. Jesus says this on the Sermon on the Mount. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For I tell you, truly, truly, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot, of the least of these will pass from the law until it's all accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So keep what Jesus says in mind here, because what Jesus is going to do in this story really makes us question whether he meant what he just said there. In fact, I suggest that as we're going to be reading through this story, we kind of put Jesus on trial a little bit to see if he actually breaks the law of Moses. I mean, the Pharisees say all the time that Jesus is breaking the law. And are they right? Well, in order for us to find out, for us, the jury, to come to our conclusion, we have to get the facts of the case down before we can make any decisions. So, let's start reading then in John chapter 7, verse 53. And we're going to go all the way to verse 11. They went each to his own house. But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning, he came again to the temple. All the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman who had been caught in adultery. And placing her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say? This they said to him, this they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. And as they continued to ask him, he stood up and said to them, Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her. And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. But when they heard it, they all went away, one by one, beginning with the older ones. And Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." So we've heard it from his own mouth. The facts of the case seem to be pretty clear, but let's just recap what happened there. So everybody goes to their own home. Jesus, on his part, it says he goes to the Mount of Olives. We're not totally sure why. We're not told why. Maybe it's to pray, maybe it's to sleep, and maybe it's both. We're not totally sure. But in the morning, he comes back to the temple and he begins to teach the people, which is his general custom. But this day, unfortunately, as he's beginning to do the teaching, he gets interrupted. Because the scribes and the Pharisees, men who are skilled in applying and in studying the law of Moses, they bring to Jesus a rather spicy conundrum. Because last night, not everybody went to their own homes. Apparently, during the night, a woman decided to have an adulterous affair. The fact that she committed adultery is not in dispute either by the crowd, by the scribes of Pharisees, by the woman, or even by Jesus. As the passage says here, apparently she had been caught in the act of adultery. You don't need to do any forensic files on it. You don't need to build any cumulative case against her. She is clearly and evidently guilty. The case is closed. She chose to violate her marriage covenant with her husband, choosing to break her vows to her husband and to do something that is so destructive to the very fabric of her family. The fact that she did this is not in dispute. The question that is before Jesus is, what do they do now? The scribes and Pharisees, the ones who've studied the law to an immense degree, they have the answer. And they tell him, they say in verse 4, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now, in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" And indeed, they're not making this up. Two passages in the law confirm that this is indeed what the law of Moses appears to say. Leviticus 20 verse 10 says this: "If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death." Likewise, we have Deuteronomy 22:22, which says, "If a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman and the woman. So you shall purge the evil from Israel." It seems pretty clear. Not only to mention the fact that in the Ten Commandments, God explicitly forbids adultery, it seems like the law of Moses is pretty clear in testifying to the guilt of this woman. And it's also pretty clear in recommending the punishment that is due to the woman: death. However, one wonders why the scribes and the Pharisees bring this case before Jesus. I mean, if it was such a clear and shut case, why did they bring her to Jesus? Why didn't they, if they caught her in the act of adultery, I mean, this isn't even accusation, they caught her in the act, why didn't they just stone her right there, right then? Why did they take her and bring her to Jesus? Well, here's what I think's going on here. It's a debated subject, but this is what I think's going on, okay? At that time, in the Roman Empire, only the Roman Empire and thus the Roman governor had the right to execute people. It wasn't given to the right wasn't given to the Sanhedrin, to the Pharisees, or to any other local body. The Roman governor himself was the only person who could execute people. However, obviously people were still getting executed, right? Literally later on in John chapter 8, Jesus almost gets killed by a mob, throwing him off a cliff, right? So, if a mob happened to get together and kill somebody, that happened. And the Roman governor might just turn a blind eye, especially if a Roman citizen wasn't involved. So people were still being killed, but it wasn't legal. It wasn't a legal way of doing it. So with that said, I think the intentions of the scribes and Pharisees at this moment is both far more sinister and, have to give them credit, quite ingenious. Because with a simple question, they put Jesus into the hot seat. Because instead of killing this woman, they bring him to Jesus. And they ask Jesus, what does he think? As a result, they place him in an unavoidable bind. Because think about it. If he says, and agreeing with apparently the law of Moses, and say, yes, the woman should be stoned, I'm sure the crowd would oblige and they would kill this woman. And the Pharisees would then take this report to the Roman governor and say, look at what Jesus is doing. He is violating the authority of Rome, and he's essentially a traitor. And with the pressure they could put on the Roman governor would not be able to turn a blind eye. The Pharisees complained quite frequently, and they would probably get their way here. And thus, the Jesus threat would be dealt with. And it's over for them. They don't have to worry about Jesus anymore. Rome would deal with them. Alternatively, if Jesus decides to say, no, you shouldn't stone her, apparently going against the law of Moses, well, then he would be discredited as a teacher. Because the people would no longer follow Jesus if he so clearly and blatantly disregards the law of Moses. And thus, the Jesus problem would be dealt with for the Pharisees. It's a win-win situation for them. Either Rome's going to be dealing with Jesus if he chooses to stone this woman, or the people will deal with Jesus if he chooses to disregard the law of Moses, and thus the Jesus threat is dealt with. And so with a simple question, what do you say? The Pharisees place Jesus in a bind. Either he sides with Moses or he sides with, against Moses, and he has to deal with the consequence. As verse 6 says, this they said to test him, that they might have some charge to bring against him. So the question is then, what will Jesus say? Well, the first thing Jesus does is he doesn't say anything. He doesn't say anything. Instead, as the passage says in verse 6, Jesus bent down and wrote with his finger on the ground. It doesn't even tell us what he wrote. We have no idea what he wrote. Maybe he was just buying time to think, because they keep on asking him, answer this question. Maybe he was buying himself time to think. Maybe he was building dramatic tension. Maybe everyone's just forgotten what he wrote. No one really knows. But after he writes this thing, he gets up and he says with a shrewd, it's really amazing, a shrewd and incredibly ingenious response that puts the scheming of the Pharisees to shame. He says this, let him who is without sin be the first to throw the stone at her. And once more he bent down and wrote on the ground. With one simple response, Jesus puts their whole scheming on its head. Because in his response, Jesus neither explicitly affirms or denies their contention. He just says, okay, let the person who's without sin be the first one to cast the stone. Did he command the execution? Or did he disregard the law of Moses? What on earth did he actually just say? Such a shrewd response keeps Jesus from trouble, both from Rome and from the people. And it puts the scribes and the Pharisees right back into the hot seat. Now all the attention is back on them. He gives them the A-OK, but on one condition. The first person to throw that stone at her must be without sin. And as he goes to write on the ground, the scribes and the Pharisees begin to think about it. And as the text says, when they heard it, they went away one by one, beginning with the older ones, and Jesus was left alone with the woman standing before him. Beginning with the older ones, they all went away. It's interesting that they make that comment, the older ones. Probably due to their life experience, they know that they are not the ones to be able to cast the first stone. that they are not without sin. And if they condemn this woman, they're in fact only condemning themselves, because all the attention of the people are squarely on the scribes and Pharisees. The trap that they laid for Jesus has been totally foiled. Again, I doubt that they really wanted to kill this woman. What they're trying to do is get Jesus in a bind, to test him. They didn't care about justice. They didn't care about the law of Moses. They wanted to catch Jesus in some sort of precarious situation and then accuse him because of it. But as they think about what Jesus says, they realize they can't do it, and one by one, they begin to leave, leaving only the woman and Jesus alone. And so with expert skill, Jesus avoids this problem. And it's perhaps an excellent example of Jesus' adage when he says, you're supposed to be wise as serpents, but as innocent as doves. That seems to be a pretty good example of Jesus' adage there, because, yeah, he's being as wise as a serpent and as innocent as doves there. That's very intriguing. But even with all of that, there should still be a question in our minds. Because, yeah, okay, the Pharisees were trying to trick Jesus. I mean, that's apparent, right? But the question that they do raise to Jesus is something that, that's a good question. Okay, like, what should we do? Jesus, we actually want to know the real answer here. Shouldn't this woman get stoned? If we're just thinking honestly about it, because when Jesus is alone with this woman, it is actually the only person who is without sin. He's the only one there now. Shouldn't he be the first one to cast the stone at her? He said that's the condition. Let the person who is without sin be the first to cast the stone. Well, that's Jesus. Jesus would totally now. Shouldn't he be stoning this woman? But what do we get instead? Verse 10. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Has nobody condemned you?" She said, "No one, Lord." And Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, sin no more." If we're the jury here, I think this is almost unavoidable. It seems like he is totally contradicting what he said in Matthew chapter 5. He said he's not here to abolish, or he says the ones who loosen the law will be least in the kingdom of heaven. Jesus, are you loosening the law here? That's what it seems like you're doing. It seems like he is abolishing the law. But ladies and gentlemen of the jury, before you go and make your decision that declares Jesus as condemned and guilty, we have to consider one more witness. And that's the law of Moses itself. The law of Moses itself actually testifies to all of us that Jesus Christ is completely right in his decision making here. The first thing we should consider is the Old Testament commands themselves. All right, so we had Exodus chapter 20, verse 10, and Deuteronomy 22, verse 22. It should be on there. There we go. It says, if a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall be put to death. And then also with Deuteronomy 20, verse 20, it says, if a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die. The man who laid with the woman and the woman. So you shall purge the evil from Israel. So the Pharisees, they came to Jesus and they claimed, this is their claim, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. So where's the man? Where's the guy? You caught her in the act, so you should have been able to bring the guy too. Why did they only bring one person? Why not both? On this fact alone, Jesus would be justified in totally throwing out their case against this woman. It's a procedural error entirely. You're only bringing one person, but the law completely commands. It's like explicit. It says both of them. It's super explicit. It's even focusing on the man, not even on the woman. And yet they focus on the woman and they totally forget about the guy. That's not making any sense. Clearly, they have other motives in their zeal against this woman. Other motives that makes it impossible for them to be the first to cast the stone against this woman. Because there's something going on in their hearts that makes them completely incapable of being judges in Israel. Completely incapable. So you look at the laws themselves, it's not Jesus who's disregarding the law, it's actually the Pharisees, men who have studied the law their whole lives. But it's not the specific laws themselves that even support Jesus here. It's the whole Old Testament law itself that supports Jesus' claim of saying, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. These Old Testament laws that we had listed there, they're called case laws. They list examples of things that have happened or things that hypothetically could happen, and they give prescribed punishments for such behavior. Now, this is what's important. The law will tell you what is just in that situation. But what is the right decision in that situation? You see the distinction I make in there? The law will give you the absolute standard of justice there for each crime that's committed. But the right decision to be made, that was actually left up to the judges in Israel. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 16 through verse 18, Moses makes this command. He says, "You shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns, and that the Lord your God has given you according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment." Moses designed the law to be used by these human judges in order to come to the right decision in any particular case. The law gives you what the absolute standard of justice is, but it was actually left up to the judges to decide what is the right decision, considering the case that's before them, considering the particularities of this case, and considering the whole law as in itself. All of that would have to inform their decision about whether they should stone this adulteress. I mean, consider this fact. How many Old Testament laws do we have? We have a few. We have like a few laws. But if you go to Edmonton and go to the law courts and ask, hey, can I get the list of laws here? They'll be like, okay, which volume do you want, right? Because we've got a lot of laws in Edmonton. And then we've got the laws in Canada, the laws of Alberta, right? We've got a lot of laws. Far more laws than what the Old Testament gives us. In fact, there is not enough laws to run a society. If you look at the Old Testament laws itself, there is not enough laws to run a society because the law wasn't necessarily meant to be used as I'm going to look at, here's the law for this specific situation. Rather, the whole Old Testament law kind of functioned as if it were like a wisdom document. And the judges themselves would have to look at the case, look at the entire law, and then decide what is the right decision here. So, in Old Testament Israel times, like way back in the day, the Pharisees are wrong in saying that Moses instantly commanded the adulterous woman should be killed. Rather, it'd be left up to judges. And we see this coming out in different passages in the Old Testament. In fact, this is off the top of my head, I don't think there's even a single example in the Old Testament where a person gets stoned for adultery. I'm trying to think. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. But I don't believe that's the case. In fact, more frequently, we get stuff like this. In Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 8, it indicates that a certificate of divorce was generally decided upon in those specific cases. Or, for example, Proverbs 6, 34 to 35, it seems to indicate that the punishment for adultery was left up to the husband. The judges decided that the person who was wronged in that case would get to have the decision on what to deal with the adulterous person. There's flexibility built in to the Old Testament law, and the Old Testament prophets seem to indicate this for us. Consider also the book of Hosea. The Old Testament book of Hosea with the prophet Hosea. He marries a prostitute. And then that woman goes back into prostitution and thus begins to commit adultery against Hosea. Now, does Hosea kill his wife for committing adultery? He doesn't. Instead, he chooses to love her and to go back to her and to show her a covenant faithfulness that is beyond what she deserved. Did Hosea disregard the law of Moses? Absolutely not. In fact, in the whole book of Isaiah, what Hosea realizes is that Yes, it would be absolutely just to demand the death penalty for his wife, but he looks at God, and he sees the character of God, both revealed in the Old Testament law itself and in that personal revelation that he was getting. He realized that his relationship with his wife committing adultery on him, is exactly like how the nation of Israel was treating God. In fact, in God's mind, he wanted us to think of it as a marriage. Israel was the wife, and God was the husband, and Israel continually went and committed adultery against God, constantly, by going and serving other gods. Now, does God immediately kill Israel on the spot? Absolutely not. In fact, that's the whole thing about Hosea. God continually went back, trying to bring Israel back to him, trying to have them value that Hesed love that he was given to them. Eventually, though, because of their stubborn rebellion, he had to execute pure justice on them. But Hosea's thinking about this, and he's looking at his wife, and he realizes though he would be absolutely just in demanding the death penalty, he would be more like his God if he chose to show love to her. The God of that Old Testament law, he would be more like that. It's perhaps for this reason, too, that Joseph, the husband of Mary, he was described in Matthew chapter 1 as a just man because he chose to divorce Mary quietly after she apparently committed adultery, right? Because in all appearance, it seemed like Mary committed adultery. But he's described as a just man. I mean, he could have killed her, right? But he knew the Old Testament law properly. He read it properly because he read it through the lens that the Old Testament prophets teach us to read the Old Testament law. And then so with Jesus. I mean, he looks at this case. Clearly, this woman has sinned. Clearly, the absolute justice that is deserved would be death. But looking at the whole of the law, he's realizing what the character of God would demand in this case. He also looks at the particulars of the case. He's seeing that the Pharisees didn't bring both of them there. It skewed justice to begin with, and he realizes this whole case is a sham. And thus, siding with the God of Moses, he says, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more." See, that statement is so in keeping with the law. Not only does the law give us the ability to show mercy, but it also would encourage us to sin no more. That's the whole purpose of the law, because God does not delight in the death of the wicked, but he desires that everyone will come and repent and believe in him. And thus Jesus says to this woman, "Sin no more." I mean, clearly there is a judgment day coming. And every single one of us is going to stand before Jesus Christ at the end of time and have to give an account for what we've done in the body, whether good or evil. But the law teaches us that God does not delight in the death of the wicked, but that they repent and turn to him, and that they meditate on his law day and night. The Pharisees wanted it to seem like Jesus was loosening the law. But it was actually the Pharisees who they don't read the Old Testament law. They read the Old Testament law, but they don't read it through the lens of the Old Testament prophets. Jesus constantly accuses them of that. They accuse Jesus of breaking the law. He accuses them of never reading the prophets. He describes them as those who have persecuted and killed the prophets, let alone not even reading them. Instead of viewing the law as a wisdom document, they viewed it as a way to maintain control and to execute people without really any care and to really just have control over people's lives. That's how they viewed the law. What a skewed way of viewing the law. Maybe that's why Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law," and then he says, "or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." It's through prophets like Hosea that we come to an actual understanding of how we should be viewing the Old Testament law. Yes, death for adultery is certainly just. But to determine what's the right course of action requires thinking about the law as a whole, seeing that in the law we have a God who provides a sacrificial system for sinful people. In the law, we have a God who delights in fellowshipping with people who are not worthy of being in his presence. He makes provision for that. We have a God who says, and I keep saying it, he does not delight in the death of the wicked. He even leaves, when he's talking about the conquest of the land, he tries to leave as much time as he can. 500 years even before the conquest of Israel or the conquest of Canaan takes place. God does not delight in the death of the wicked. And we need to look at the law as a whole in order to figure out what's the right decision to make. But the question was, did the Pharisees read the prophets? And that's the question that we have to ask ourselves. Do we read the prophets? Do we read the Old Testament law and read it properly? Because if we read it the way the Pharisees read it, there's going to be a lot of dead people around. A lot of dead people. Because we all do things according to the law that has violated the law and deserves death. Remember, Jesus absolutely, their claim that he loosens the law is so crazy, because what Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount is, even if you look at a woman with lustful intent, you've committed adultery in your heart. Okay? So Jesus is not loosening the law, he is fulfilling it. He is bringing it to its intention, not only to stop the act, but to stop the desire that leads to the act. And we're all guilty of that. But the law shows us a God who provides for sinful people. The law tells us what we deserve, but grace gives us what we don't deserve. And so this passage shows us that we ourselves, people of the book, people of the law, ought not to be quick to deal out the death and judgment that the Pharisees wanted to do, because none of us are without sin, and we've all received the grace and mercy that comes from God himself. Like Jesus shows, our ultimate goal is to train and lead people in the way of Jesus, the way of the law. That's our goal. It's not to bring that condemnation. It's not to kill. It's not to kill. Because only one person had the right to execute that woman that day. He's the only one that had the right to cast the first stone. And here he spared all of us. This passage teaches us that we should never disregard the Old Testament law. The Old Testament law that's weird and kind of bizarre and kind of boring sometimes, right? You kind of feel like, oh man, it's the death of any Bible reading plan. But he tells us that we're supposed to keep on reading it. And in fact, that's what Psalm 1 says. You know, it's like, whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and on that law he meditates day and night. I mean, we're not Israel, right? The church doesn't have the right to execute people anyway, right? So, and I'm not saying we should ever do that, right? But we don't need to be Israel in order to have these laws apply to our lives and give us wisdom to live in our daily lives. Because Jesus did not in the least bit dismiss the law. Rather, he read the law the way it was supposed to be read, as the prophets reveal. This passage also shows us that nobody is beyond the mercy that God can give. Even this no-named woman who committed adultery, even she received an undeserved, merciful pardon by the Lord Jesus Christ, with the exhortation to sin no more, because there is a judgment day. And that sentence will be passed. But today is the day of mercy. Today is the day of pardon. And everyone who comes to Jesus Christ will be saved. Will be saved. So the facts of the case are set before us, so for us to make our judgment as to whether Jesus Christ is guilty or innocent of violating the law of Moses. And I hope as you make your decision, I hope you conclude that Jesus in absolutely no way abolished the law with his actions here. Rather, he fulfilled the law. Amen.